He's heard it all before. You're a pastor. You're not supposed to get political. You shouldn't be talking about these issues, so just stay out of politics and stick to preaching the gospel. Life, marriage, sexuality, borders, ethnicity. These things aren't political. They're biblical. God's word has much to say about the culture we're living in. This is Our Watch with Tim Thompson.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Our Watch. I am Tim Thompson, excited to be here with you today, and I've got a very special guest with me today. Mark Meuser is running for U.S. Senate right here in California. Glad to have you here today, Mark.
Hey, glad to be in the studio with you.
Yeah, you know, I just want to take a moment for you to be able to introduce yourself. I have some things that to me are important about you, but first of all, let's hear from you.
Well, I'm a constitutional attorney. I have a track record of basically fighting against the bureaucrats, fighting against big business, big tech, for the people. And you know, when Gavin Newsom shut down churches, I had a total of 3 different lawsuits I was a part of that we took to the Supreme Court to get churches reopened. So I am a constitutional attorney who fights for the people against big business, big tech, and big government.
Not only that, but you're also a pastor's kid.
I am.
You are. And that, to me, that's cool. You know, you look at a lot of, right now, obviously our audience right now, we're really reaching out to pastors here in California. To me, it's really cool to see a pastor's kid who is involved, engaged, protecting, our religious liberties, which we've seen are under attack for a long time now, and people like you standing up for us. To me, it's just a great treasure that we have people like you, and now running for U.S. Senate to me is super important. We need people like you to get elected.
Well, thank you. It's not your traditional path, but hey, we've had plenty of presidents or politicians who have similar backgrounds, but I grew up in the church, as you say, and I understand the importance of making sure that the government does not interfere with individuals' First Amendment right to pursue their faith.
Right. So how has growing up as a pastor's kid, how's that, led you to what you're doing today?
That's a pretty broad question. Growing up, there were always a lot of books in the house, and, I was encouraged to read not only the Bible, but read elsewhere. And some of my early, as an early teenager, some of the books I was reading about our history, our rich history, and why the founding fathers, were so important about putting the First Amendment in there.
Right.
What, not just what the document said, but what was going on in history that led to the First Amendment, which led to this separation of powers and led to the government not supposed to interfere with what the pastors were doing. A lot of that early history is what drove me to becoming a lover of our type of government, and led me to become a constitutional attorney where I fought back against the government when they overstep.
So loving the type of government we have, I think that's...
Had.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so where do you see us now? I mean, what we set up in the beginning and where we're at right now, definitely there needs to be some sort of change. And I'm assuming that's why you're running. You're hoping to be a part of that change, a part of the solution. Talk about where you see you fitting into that solution and getting us back on track.
Well, a lot of the stuff that needs to be done, you as a pastor and the Christians have to be involved.
Right.
There's a cultural aspect of this problem that has to be solved. But it's really hard for you to do your job when you are being persecuted by the tyranny of unelected bureaucrats who are dictating whether your church can be open, how many people are allowed to be in, what people must wear,
whether or not we can sing.
Yeah.
When
you have the unelected bureaucracy that's interfering with your ability to do your job, that there's a huge problem. If you go back in history, the Bubonic Plague, one of the biggest, pandemics of this world's existence, who was it who was still remaining open? It was the pastors, the priests, who were the last line of defense, the line of hope for the people who were remaining in their job. And at this time around, when we had the COVID pandemic, what was the first line that they wanted to do? They wanted to shut down all hope that the people had. They wanted to shut down people's ability to communicate with one another. And that is a huge problem. But as you know, so it's one thing to go in there and pass laws. But there's another thing that you can't legislate morality.
Right.
Right. You just can't do it. The thing is, there's supposed to be limitations of power. There's supposed to be limited government. We the people have a right of self-governance. We have the right to dictate the direction of our life, and we yield certain authority to our duly elected representatives. We can't, so one of the biggest problems I see is this unelected bureaucracy through mandate, which is depriving us of our fundamental principles. So as a legislature, when I become your United States Senator, one of the things that I want to do is return us to that balance of power that we had. I want to return us to that point where we're only being governed by our duly elected representatives. That being said, the church needs to step up,
Right.
because, Hollywood has stepped up.
Right. Yeah, there's no doubt. Right. And you bring up the bubonic plague. What I'm hearing you say is if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we're seeing what they've done. They've studied history. They know that the church was stepping up back in the bubonic plague. So that's, like you said, the first thing they went after here. So we definitely need to step up, protect our religious liberties. You're somebody that's doing that. We have somebody else with us today that does that as well. A good friend of mine, Bob Tyler, with Advocates for Faith and Freedom, religious liberty attorney. Bob, so glad to have you here.
Hey, guys. How are you? Sorry I'm a little late. Hello, Mark. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
No, it's great. It's great to have you here. We've got some news we want to share on your end, but we want to first continue kind of talking about what we're talking about here. Having Mark Meuser here, he's got a plan on what we can do to really turn some things around. And glad to have you here because I love your insight, the questions you're going to bring to the table as we talk about what Mark is calling the People's Plan. Now, this just went live, you said yesterday, on your website, the People's Plan. First of all, what's your website so people can connect with you?
MarkMeuser.com, MarkMeuser.com. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Truth Social.
All right. Well, we're going to make sure we put ways to connect with you in the comment section so that way people can they can connect with you. I also want to tell our audience right now, make sure that if you have questions for Mark, send them in on YouTube, send them in on Rumble. You can also email us at info@ourwatch.com. We'd love to answer your questions. As many as we can get to, we'll get to. But let's talk about your plan, the People's Plan. How did you come up with this?
Well, as you've kind of heard a couple times, I have a long history of fighting for the people, whether it's, against big business. I've sued many Fortune 500 companies in my career. I've fought against big tech. I fought against big government. And it always seems to be that I'm fighting on behalf of the people. And, the Constitution starts off with we the people. We're supposed to be a government of the people, for the people. And unfortunately, we have really turned into a government of special interest for special interest.
Right.
And so, I want to return us back. Just last week, we saw the passage of the Inflation Reduction Bill. And the buzzwords that were being used is, we're going to be going after the rich. But 2/3 of the bill was pet projects for the rich. It was how the rich are going to get better. So it's like, we're closing this loophole over here, but there's 15 other loopholes, 500 other loopholes that were created in that bill. And unfortunately, special interest has plenty of legislators who they have in their pocket. And I just felt, I have a history of fighting against big government. I have a history of fighting on behalf of the people. And I wanted to let the people know that I'm not bought and paid for by special interests. I'm going to D.C. to represent the people, to return us to a Republican form of government where we are only going to be governed by the laws passed by our duly elected representatives, which means we're going to have to rein in the administration. We're going to have to return the power back to the people's house, to Congress, to run the appropriations. It shouldn't be seeing these crazy bills that come down that the administration is now determining that we're spending money here. And it's like, where was that in the budget?
Right. Right. So prioritizing our pocketbook, that's one of the top things that you have here on your list. The next one on here is very important to me, Bob. I know it's very important to you, and it's educating our children. And this is something that you and I have been working on literally for years. There's an assault on the family within the government-ran school system, and it's educating our children is a huge issue that has to be addressed, right?
It sure does. And one of the things I think, Mark, that what encourages me about you is, like you said, you have been in the battle. You've been dealing with a lot of the legal issues with regard to liberty generally. What about with regard to education? Have you been involved in battling in regard to the education front with regard to the craziness of the school districts or the sex ed? Or
I haven't necessarily been involved in the litigation side. I've been involved more legislative or helping people formulate their plans and that they've been doing. So I haven't necessarily been in the court on the issue, but I have been involved from the perspective of how do we lobby? How do we talk about this? What are some of the issues? But I have been involved with education.
Have you seen any of the sex ed curriculum that has been promoted?
I have not actually seen it. I've heard all the summaries. I've read all the summaries, but I've never actually picked up a textbook and looked at it.
Well, should you get into should you be elected, which we hope you are, we've got copies of what's happened here in California. And I'm hearing across the country with the curriculum that's written by these leftist organizations, by Planned Parenthood and others that are being infiltrating our schools, teaching kids how to use cucumbers in order to apply a condom and other unimaginable. Well,
that's pretty light. What you just brought up.
That is very light. I mean, I could give you some very disturbing sexual images that most adults haven't thought about.
Yeah. Well,
that they're promoting.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that, there's a lot of federal money that is spent on education, and the left has done a very good job over the years of weaponizing that funding and using it to force down onto the small school districts where they don't seem to have much authority over what's being taught. And I think it's time to flip that around and mandate with that money that comes down transparency so that every parent has the ability to look on the web and know exactly what their child is going to be taught the very next day. We need to make sure that parents have the tools to understand what's being taught to their kids and also have the tools to, if they disagree with what's going on. I mean, unfortunately, what's going on right now is that our children are being treated as if they belong to the government, not to the parents.
Right.
And so we're going to have to make sure that there are proper steps taken so that funding follows the student, not the government organizations. A zip code should not determine where that funding goes. If a kid is not getting the education that they need, and understand that every one of our children are different. They have different needs. And even if it was not, you don't like the sex education, there are just some students who have different needs, and certain teachers can't meet that need. And so if you need to go to another school so that your child gets the education that they deserve so that they can live the American dream for them, they shouldn't be held hostage because that money is a part of some legacy system that says, no, it goes to this zip code.
So what I hear you saying, you're for school choice.
Yes. That's
okay. All right.
Yeah. Mark, throw out a proposal for you. Maybe this could be your first bill that you propose. A little background. So The background is I've litigated against a lot of school districts in California, and in California, there's the school districts are deemed to be an agent of the state, effectively, to some degree. So it's unique to California because the rest of the states are not that way. Local school districts are not deemed to be the, quote, state, whereas in California, local school districts are deemed to be the state for purposes of litigation, which means that the 11th Amendment immunity that protects the state, it says states can't be sued for monetary damages.
Yes.
And therefore, school districts cannot be sued for monetary damages effectively. You can sue local school districts for injunctive relief, but you don't get to go after them for monetary damages. And now that's in federal court. Okay?
Yes.
Lawsuits can be brought in state court, but you can't bring it in federal court. But one of the problems is that because in California they're deemed agents of the state has a lot more control over what happens on a local level. So when the federal money passes through to the state then has, the Department of Education has this ability to really hold the purse strings.
Yes.
And determine whether or not money gets passed down. And when there are laws that are passed, and Tim, you've seen this, where the superintendents say, I agree with you. I agree with your position that we shouldn't be teaching this horrific sex ed curriculum. I agree that we shouldn't be, teaching some satanic whatever. But we can't do anything about it because the state's required this of us. I don't see that as being the same in other states. But it seems to me that one way to bypass and prevent this problem from occurring is to have a bill that says all federal money goes straight to all federal money for education goes straight to the local school district.
Yeah, we definitely need to return the power to the sources closest to the people. Unfortunately, what's happened over the last 200 plus years of our nation's history is our federal government keeps growing and growing and growing and growing in size, and power is compounding in fewer individuals. And the whole purpose of our separation of powers, having states, local, federal government, with everybody having their own unique power, is that you didn't concentrate all the power in a few people. And so we do need, especially with our education, to bring it back down to the local school district, where your school board is answerable to the parents, where the teachers can respond to the parents and the needs of that community. And anything that reduces the power and the influence of Washington, D.C. and unelected bureaucrats on the say that they have over our children's education, I am 100% behind that.
So let's move on. We got a lot of these things that we want to get through, and I just want to remind everybody that's tuned in, if you've got questions for Mark Meuser, Senate, he's a candidate for U.S. Senate, and if you're just joining us, candidate for U.S. Senate here in the state of California. If you have any questions for him, shoot them over to info@ourwatch.com. We'd love to answer your questions. And also, you can do those online, YouTube or Rumble. Go ahead and send over your questions. We'd love to answer those for you. So you've got this, the People's Plan. We've talked about prioritizing your pocketbook, educating our children. You also talk about overhauling our infrastructure. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, here in California, but we have some serious issues with our water, with our electricity grid, our roads. There are so much real true infrastructure problems that need to be solved. Now, last year, there was the infrastructure bill that went through, and I actually took the time to actually study every single page of it, just like I studied every single page of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically the Special Interest Retirement Fund Act. But that being said, when you looked at their Infrastructure Act from a year ago, well over half of it went to studies, went to paying back other lobbyists. It did not actually go to true infrastructure spending. And some of the problems that we're dealing with infrastructure is that the laws have been written so that groups that oppose the infrastructure are able to shut down the projects. We recently saw that here in the state of California, where they're trying to do a desalination plant. Israel did it and has made them one of the most successful countries.
Very successful.
They're exporting water, they're exporting food, they're becoming a better economy. We look at the state of California, there's not like there's that much more water that we could put behind dams.
Right.
But our population has been doubled since the last dam was ever put up in the state. In fact, many groups are trying to tear down some of our dams, which is going to hurt our electric grid. It's going to hurt our water storage. And so one of the things that we have to do, and there's several bills before the Senate right now, not that they're going to see the light of day this year, but there's several bills to reduce the time that the courts can hold up government projects due to environmental concerns or whatever. And once the government has done the studies, we can't push these contracts off for 20 years while the parties are able to litigate every which way. And so there's some common sense proposals to streamline the process. Now, when a government has a project, the environmental groups are not going to be able to hold it hostage behind a bunch of red tape and in gobbledygook. So we need to do that. We need to also stop this process of just using taxpayer dollars to study the problems. And when you really look at the studies, one of my favorite studies was from the last infrastructure bill was we're going to spend millions of dollars studying why women don't like being truck drivers.
I don't know that that's a good use of my tax dollars.
Yeah, the most recent one, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it was $8 billion. Sorry.
Wow.
$8 billion that's being spent on studying whether there is a different feed requirement that you could give to cows to reduce their methane emissions. $8 billion to study different formulas of food to be given to cows.
Wow. Something, I guess AOC would be good with that.
Yeah. So there's, the thing is, I don't think anybody's out there is opposed to better roads.
Right.
The problem is we got to streamline the process and actually put the money to roads rather than, this group gave us great campaign contributions. They have this study that they'd like the government to fund that really, at the end of the day, is not going to do anything to actually fix the problems and give us better roads. So we got to get rid of all the graft, and we also have to get rid of the litigation hostage to any government project.
Right.
Mark, we've heard a lot about, over the years, this has gone on for my whole lifetime, the $10,000 toilet seat that, all this government waste and abuse. How do you overcome that? Well, what would you do as a senator to prevent that from happening? I'm not sure how you would do that.
It actually goes back to the budgeting and appropriations. And what the process is they basically, okay, how much money did you get last year? How much more money do you need this year? And they just keep piling it on. And there are government programs that haven't been used for 50 years, but they're still getting that money. And unfortunately, when it's not your money, when you didn't have to earn it, there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that can happen very, very quickly. And whether they're actually paying $10,000 for a toilet seat or $600 hammers or whatever,
right,
how much of that is just being disguised of, the money going into other pet projects? And so there needs to be stronger appropriations saying, and we got to go back and we got to look at these programs. In the area of law, as you're well aware, there's a thing called a key tam lawsuits. And in a key tam lawsuit, if a whistleblower says, the government is being defrauded here, the person who blows the whistle, the key tam, actually gets, after the successful prosecution of the case, the person who blew the whistle will actually get an award. And I think we have to bring that into our government budgeting and say, if you work for a government agency and you are aware of waste, fraud, and abuse, and you bring that to light, and the Senate and the House actually reduce the budget because of the evidence that you brought forth that this is no longer spending where it's supposed to be spent, then you, as a government worker, are going to actually see a financial bonus as a result of that. And so rather than having all these government bureaucrats hoarding that money because, we can't afford to lose our budget next year, get them to be working for the people and saying, you know what, this waste, fraud, and abuse, let's incentivize them, bringing that to the attention of the people who have the power of the purse, Congress, and making sure that we can respond to it, because no one senator can monitor all the appropriations that's out there.
I don't know. This is the first time I've heard of that. I think it's a great idea. To me, it almost seems like something, especially with the Freedom of Information Act, you could if you were a entrepreneur, you could start up a company that says, I'm going to demand all the documents there, and then you go find where the waste is and try to get that money back. I mean, I think that's a great way of holding people accountable. I want to move on because we still have a few more to get through, and then we want to ask some questions. Again, if you have questions for Mark Meuser, please send them over, info@ourwatch.com. You can also put those in on Facebook and Rumble, YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. You talk about protecting our communities in your People's Plan. Talk about that, if you would.
Well, the problem is right now we're living in a day and age where politicians have become pro-criminal. We're living in a day and age where we have elected, DAs who are supposed to be enforcing the law that are actually not enforcing the law against the criminals. And, we saw during COVID, the law was gone after businesses. How dare you thumb your nose at our government mandate? But, you killed a couple people. Go no bail. Go ahead. Go back out and live on the street. And there just seems to be this pro-criminal mentality. And the thing is, a lot of federal spending is brought down to the state and to the local level to help them investigate and pursue justice. And some of the things that we're going to need to start doing is because believe it or not, your Constitution tells you that it's the duty of the Senate and the House to ensure that we have a Republican form of government. That is not a political issue. I mean, that's not a judicial issue, which means courts cannot rule on whether or not something is a Republican form of government. And I'm sure Bob has faced that in several court cases where it's like, wait a second, this is not a Republican form of government. This whole thing should be thrown out. Well, courts will not go down that path. But it is a political issue, which means your senator and your congressman actually have the duty to ensure that what is going on at the state level, that they are guaranteeing to the citizens a Republican form of government. And in a Republican form of government, your executives are to enforce the law. And when we have local elected officials like DAs who are not enforcing the law, then it is the duty of the Senate under our Constitution to help protect the people's right of a Republican form of government. And so using the power of the purse, and I'm looking at other options also, we're going to be looking at how we could punish those local officials who are refusing to follow the laws to protect their citizens.
Mark, this goes even beyond, sorry.
No, go ahead,
this
please.
Goes even beyond criminal issues.
Yeah.
Let's go back to COVID and what we've been fighting for years.
Exactly.
Because with COVID, the lawbreakers typically were started with the governor by declaring a state of emergency and eliminating lots of procedures that are democratic form of government or Republican form of government would allow for, such as hearings, public hearings, things of that nature for new regulations to be adopted, to be passed. So with COVID, we have these health orders that were adopted. And as you know, because you've been involved in the litigation like I have, challenging what I think is this unconstitutional form of government where you have local health officials who are given this extreme authority, dictatorial authority where they basically can say what's legal and what's not, where they can say churches are not permitted to meet on Sundays. And so...
And this is really why I decided that I had to run for U.S. Senate, is because I saw what was going on in the courts, and the courts, you know, the best argument that we had in every single case against every single mandate is that it violates our right as an American to live in a self-governed society where we're only governed by the laws by our duly elected representatives. That's what COVID revealed to me more than anything else, is just how far we had strayed. You know, yes, we've had this administrative law, but at least there was some procedures there.
Right.
There was absolutely no procedures. It's whatever this unelected bureaucrat said that the law was for that day, and businesses were having to change on a dime. And there's just it was watching what happened during COVID just really revealed to me that we have to fix this at the federal level, and it's going to take somebody who's been in the trenches, who's litigated these issues, who's been a student of the United States Constitution long before I ever went to college. I had a first edition set of the Madison Papers that I bought as a teenager. You know, as somebody who studied, taught, and been litigated the Constitution and understands why the Founding Fathers had these provisions in, that's what it's going to take to go to D.C. and start reining in this unelected, unconstitutional, un-Republican form of government that we have been dictated to over the last, for a long time. It's just COVID put it on steroids.
A lot of decisions being made by unelected bureaucrats like county council.
County council, yeah.
Every county council's out there, and a lot of them are appointed, and they're not elected, depending on where you're at.
But even if they are elected, they're elected to be an executive. They're on the executive branch. Your duly elected representatives on the federal level is your senator and your congressman, not the president. Mm-hmm. On the state level is your state senator, your state assemblyman, not your governor, not your AG. Those people are not, they're executives. Yeah. On the county level is your county supervisors, not your county public health officer. And on the city level is your city council. And you got to understand the difference of executive and representative. And the best example I've ever seen of this is the example of Andrew Johnson. Congress passed a law. According to the Constitution, he vetoed it. But according to the Constitution, Congress overrode his veto. And he basically said, I don't care. I'm not going to enforce this law. And that is what led to the first impeachment trial of a president, is when a executive branch of the government said, I don't care what the people said. I'm going to do what I want to do. And when the executive branch has the power to make the law and enforce the law, we are no longer in a Republican form of government. And so that's why it is so critical that the Senate, and to get back to our question, why it's so critical that our Senate and our Congress retake that power and help distinguish, no, executive, you don't make the laws. All you are there to do is to enforce the laws that the people, through their duly elected representatives, put into place.
I want to emphasize something right there that you just said. That let's bring it back to a state level. Let's go back to the same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage was a circumstance where the vast majority of the voters voted to preserve marriage between one man and one woman. And our current city governor was the mayor of San Francisco at that time. And what that mayor did was Governor Newsom said, I'm going to ignore what the people voted and what they established, that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. And I've often said, litigating that case, it doesn't matter whether you are in favor or opposed to same-sex marriage. Let's think about what this is going to do if this mayor can ignore the will of the people and not enforce the law. Then we're creating a circumstance where, it's basically, I called it municipal anarchy back then, and that's what it was. Now, why is it important that we have someone like you who understands this? Because the information that I was given was that back when Mayor Gavin Newsom decided to ignore the will of the people, he went and advised certain people from California's elected representatives, including Dianne Feinstein, what he was going to do. And no one did anything about it until our nonprofit organization stepped up and did what the state attorney general was supposed to do, and that's enforce the law. But none of them would enforce the law and go in and put a stop to what was happening there. And, here you're in a situation where, you're running for Senate. We don't need any more people like Alex Padilla and Dianne Feinstein who are going to ignore what the responsibility is. You have to understand that role, and we've got two senators who don't.
So you talk about protecting our communities. Another line item there is limiting government overreach, and it almost sounds like those two go hand in glove.
Well, sorry, but yeah, I mean we've kind of covered that point in a lot of the other points here. So
right. You also talk about ensuring our supply chain. I look at what's happening in grocery stores. Anybody who's building a building is seeing this, where construction deadlines are having to be pushed out because supply chains are not working the way they should. There's a lot of things that, in my mind, seem to be manufactured as far as what's happening. It's like a manufactured problem. It's a problem that exists but does not need to exist. So when you talk about ensuring our supply chain, how do you see it as not being insured right now, and how do you see what's the resolve to this? How do we get it fixed?
Well, I'm going to bring it to a practical application. And just a couple of weeks ago, Nestle came out with a press release saying that they're not going to be able to do as much Halloween candy this year. Now, that's not the end of the world for you and me that we don't get our pumpkin Reese's peanut butter cup or whatever, but it actually represents the bigger problem. And whether it's what's going on at the ports, and how the state government here in California, through some of the laws that we have regarding independent truckers, the effect that has there's a lot of aspects of what's going on right now where there's even poor planning. The war in Ukraine, everybody knew that the war in Ukraine was going, and yet there was no planning at the federal level to what can we do in the states to make sure that we have have more food for the shortage that we're going to have because of that. And there's many people predicting that this fall we're going to start seeing a food shortage that's going to be, we're going to find out. I mean, I remember back the spring when walking into the grocery store and there wasn't a gallon of milk that you could buy because of the supply chain issues.
Right.
And doing nothing is not going to be a solution. But it's also, there's not one simple thing. The problem that our nation has had is we have been running on a broken system of just-in-time delivery. And what that meant is that people didn't have inventories. You go back to your grandfather's time, every company would have large inventories of supplies that if a hiccup happened, they would be able to go a week, a month, or whatever.
Right.
Our businesses and our industries have moved off of that to where it became a just-in-time delivery. And when all of a sudden you throw a monkey wrench into that, it has long-term ramifications. And I've seen some reports that say it's going to be 5 to 10 years before we ever unwind all the damage we did for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And anybody with any kind of common sense knew that the second we did 2 weeks to flatten the curve, that it was going to have long-term ramifications on the whole process.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Semiconductor industry.
Yes.
Taiwan manufactures, I want to say it's over 50%. I was reading an article in the BBC yesterday. And with Taiwan manufacturing over 50% of the world's semiconductors, and you have Nancy Pelosi showing up in Taiwan and China doing these drills all around. If you see the map on where China was doing their military drills, it was in the ocean all around Taiwan, breaching the airspace, etc. So kind of two questions. And I don't know what the right answer is, but first question is, if China did attack Taiwan, would you support military U.S. military going in to defend Taiwan? Secondly, as an aside, a different question is, how do we prevent this problem where all of the 50% of the semiconductors are being manufactured at a very vulnerable location?
Well, the second one is actually the easier of the two questions, because we can go back to our Constitution. And our Constitution, the main form of income that the federal government had was through tariffs, which means when something was brought into this country, there was a tax put upon the foreign supplier of goods. And through Congress, and there was some abuses here, there became some protectionism. I got to protect my industry. And so if you're bringing in something that came in that's competing against this American industry, we're going to tax you a little bit more. And so that way it was more competitive to actually manufacture or produce goods here in the United States. Unfortunately, when we have moved to this free world, open marketplace, duty-free, what that has meant is it made it very hard for the United States government to protect its interest. And I have, clear back in the 90s, when Bill Clinton was up there talking about these free trade agreements, I, as somebody, who was a teenager who studied the Constitution, I was like, no, we got to allow the federal government to be able to put tariffs on things to ensure that some of the basic necessities, oil, semiconductors. I mean, we saw what happened when the chips were not available for cars, and all of a sudden nobody could buy a car in the United States.
Right.
We got to make sure that there's that we do not import from our enemies the supplies that we need to even exist as a country. And so the concept of free trade actually is a concept of no sovereignty. And that's one of the things that we need to be looking at. We could go back and study the abuses of the Senate and the Congress back in the 1800s with protectionism, and we could find ways to maybe deal with that issue. But what we've done is we've bent so far over the other direction that it creates a problem. The thing about Taiwan, the time to stop a war is before a war starts. And unfortunately, our current commander-in-chief has showed that he can't protect our own borders. He couldn't help our own troops get out of Afghanistan. And he couldn't stop a war in Ukraine. So unfortunately, if China decides to attack Taiwan, I do not have a lot of hope for this current administration doing anything, regardless of the need for our federal government. I mean, hey, we needed to stop the war in Ukraine because that's what 30% of the nation, not of the world's grain supply. But the time to show, Ronald Reagan said, peace through strength.
Right.
Joe Biden is war through weakness. We do have to. We cannot afford to be going and fighting wars on every single continent. But you have to be. We have to have the wherewithal. We have to have the strength. We have to have agreements. I think it was FDR who saw, okay, we need to have 4 policemen. You had Great Britain, you had China, you had Russia, and you had the United States. When you have just United States against China, it starts creating problems. When it's the United States against Russia, there is problems. The G6, the G7, the G20, all these organizations, nobody wants war. But you have to understand, just like Russia and Putin always wanted Ukraine, China, for my entire life, has wanted Taiwan. This is a real threat, and it has major impacts upon the United States' safety and freedom. And but that war has to be won before a single shot is fired. And right now, the administration is not preparing the United States to silence China. I give great credit to Nancy Pelosi landing her plane in Taiwan. That took guts to go against her own party and thumb her nose and say, I'm doing what's right. Now, unfortunately, she's come out and made some political statements to kowtow to China in the last couple of weeks, which I don't like. But her actions of going to Taiwan, I think that was very important. I understand other legislatures are going to Taiwan right now. Taiwan is a very important issue. We know it's coming down, and we need to stop it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would have been an incredible sign of weakness had she not landed. Weakness on the part of America. It was imperative that that plane landed there just to show that we're not going to be pushed around.
I don't have a lot of nice things to say about Nancy Pelosi, but I got to give credit where credit's due. And I appreciate what she did there that day.
You talk about this is the last one on your list. So this is for those of you that may be just now tuning in. We're with Mark Meuser. He's a U.S. Senate candidate right here in California. He has on his website markmeuser.com, correct?
Yeah.
He has what he calls the People's Plan. He talks about prioritizing your pocketbook, educating our children, overhauling our infrastructure, protecting our communities, limiting government overreach, ensuring our supply chain, and finally sustaining our resources. Just briefly, if you would share with us about that. Then we're going to get to some questions. By the way, if you haven't sent your questions in, you still have time. info@rwatch.com. You can also throw those on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Rumble. All those things. We're looking at it. We want to answer your questions. So sustaining our resources.
I've kind of been I've been practicing my filibuster here answering your questions, and I've kind of addressed it of what we got to do with water, what we have to do with electricity. There's very important issues that we need to be dealing with, whether it's through infrastructure or through our natural resources, to make sure that everybody in California, everybody in the United States has the ability to, nobody wants to drink dirty water. Nobody wants to live in a smog-filled city, but we need to make sure that we get in with like our forests, and we need to clean and thin them so that, number one, we reduce forest fires. Number two, that the snow actually lands on the ground and actually gets into our aquifers. We need to make sure that, and also when there's a forest fire, it lets out a lot of carbon emissions. So there's some practical stuff that we can agree with across the aisle that we need to make sure that we sustain our resources. We got to make sure that people have clean drinking water. We got to make sure that people have electricity, because if they're going to buy an electric car, they can't afford to live up in the mountains where their power is off for 3 weeks because of a snowstorm. That's not sustainable.
Right. All right. Well, let's get to some questions. First question that came in. How big a deal is it that the IRS is wanting to add 87,000 agents?
Well, all you have to do is do the math of how many people make more than $400,000 a year and start doing some very simple division and understand that they're not coming after the few, 1%, or I think it's 1.5% of tax forms of people who make more than $400,000. This is going after everybody. We all saw the post by the IRS where they were asking for people to be hired who could carry guns. This is very scary what's going on in our nation. And, you elect me, we're going to be looking at the IRS's budget and how we can pare it back starting next year.
Amen to that. This next question, I know, Bob, this is for you and me. This has been something that we've been hoping for, we've been wanting, and that is getting the pastors involved. And the question is, how important is it for the church to get more involved by educating them in these issues? I want to throw that question your way and then have you ask Mark, the same type of question, but just maybe a more clarified question on that, because you've been involved in getting pastors involved in this process.
I think, for anybody watching, wanting to determine, particularly any pastor wanting to determine whether or not they would support you, it might be relevant and important to them, I hope it is, whether or not you support the Johnson Amendment. And the Johnson Amendment, for sake of those watching is that rule that came in not too long ago. I think it was in 1956 that created a provision in the Internal Revenue Code that prohibited nonprofit 501c3 organizations to engage in political activity. In other words, and that's stating it very overbroad. That's not actually what it says. What it says is that 501c3 cannot spend more than a substantial amount of their funds on political activities, cannot endorse a particular candidate or a particular party. So, though, the Johnson Amendment's out there, and that's something that should be eliminated, in my opinion. What's your opinion?
I would agree with this, but I want to go back to kind of the overarching question here. And, we've all heard the statistics, 25% of evangelical Christians are even participating. And why I shake my head every time I hear that statistic. And I mean, I've personally took voting registration rolls, compared them with church bulletins, and I would ask every pastor to go take your church bulletin and compare the voting rolls and see for yourself just how many of your parishioners are actually participating in church. And I don't care how good of a pastor you are, you're going to be surprised at how few members of your church actually participate in the elections. And unfortunately, when the silent majority are not participating in the elections, we're getting the government that we are voting for. And, but that's, that's not spiritual. Wait a second. What did Jesus say? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. Now, on Sunday morning, you're at church, you're paying your tithe, you're participating in that system. But you are also a citizen of the United States of America. And in that form of government, we the people are the government. And we are to select our leaders. Now, we all are aware in the book of Exodus where Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came out and said, hey, select for me the people and I will choose the judges. But we rarely pay attention to Deuteronomy. Right before Moses dies, right before they go into the promised land, there is a second selection of judges that goes on. And in that passage, Moses tells the people, okay, my time on this earth is about done. I'm no longer going to be your leader. And it's up to you to select the people to rule over you. The first time Moses did it. The second time he turned to the people and said, you select the people. And I'm reminded in Psalms chapter 11, verse 3, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now that word foundation has a very unique Hebrew meaning, and it's political and moral support. So when you go look at Psalms 11:3, when the political and moral supports are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The thing is, we are dual citizens. We are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, but we are also citizens of the United States of America, where we have a right of self-governance. And in that right of self-governance, we are to choose leaders who rule over us. And we have a choice. If we do not participate, our leaders will be chosen for us. And they are no longer going to pass laws that protect our right to even have our churches open. So, if I'm talking to a pastor, I'm putting it on you. Because we can get you a copy of the voter rolls. And you can take a look at, you don't have to give us your church directory. You look up your people and you see who's voting and who's not voting. And
right.
And you make the determination whether or not your parishioners are actually being responsible citizens of the United States and rendering to Caesar what belongs to Caesar's.
Yeah, I agree with you in hearing what you're saying, but I go back to what Bob had said. Here's the fact. There's a lot of pastors that are not engaged in this process. To ask them to go look up their voter registration, that's politics. I'm not supposed to do that. What do you agree with Bob? And I agree with Bob. So do you agree with us that the Johnson Amendment should be repealed? It really, to me, in my mind, is unconstitutional.
Yeah, the Johnson Amendment has no bearing in the constitutional law.
All right, agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question that was brought out. Do you believe that there is a red wave coming in November? And if so, why?
I'll just keep this to California-centric, because I literally study the polls every single day. If you look at California and you look at the independent voters, declined to states, they voted for Joe Biden by over 20 points. They're now negative 40 points on him. There's been like a 60-point swing among independent voters when it comes to their views on Joe Biden. You look at the Hispanic voters, the Latino voters in California. They voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden by over 40 points. They're now underwater with that demographic. You look at the youth, those people below age 35. That is a demographic that Joe Biden won in great numbers. He is now underwater in great numbers. So when I start looking at the people who are going to be voting this November, people who don't typically vote in primary elections but do tend to show up, when I start breaking down the polling data and really start looking at the groups, what you see is that people are 60% of this state can't even pay their bills because of inflation. People are concerned about safety on their street, and they know which party is saying defund the police. People understand the price of gas right now and the impact that is having. They understand the need to be energy independent. People understand what's going on with their kids and how their kids do not have the same opportunity that they had. COVID awoke many parents because they now had to have a more active role in their children's education. And that, I think, was a good thing, where parents all of a sudden realized, wait a second, this is not right. And so when I start looking at these demographics that do not typically participate in the primaries but will be showing up in the November election, I do believe that there is going to be a major red wave. I do believe that there is going to be a landslide election where the people say enough is enough. I think what we saw last week was the FBI raid. And, I immediately went out and was talking to liberal attorneys, independents, and they had great concerns about the weaponizing and the politicizing of the nation's top law firm, the nation's top law enforcement office. Yeah. And so as I look at this stuff, as we move into the fall, as we start seeing more food shortages, as we see the price of gas continue to go up, because we're about ready to reach the end of the 6 months of draining down our strategic reserves. We're about ready to hit that cap of that 6 months that he said. Gas prices are going to start going up. We saw what just happened with the Inflation Reduction Bill that's going to do nothing but increase our gas prices. As we hit this fall, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be a good time for the pocketbook of Americans. And I think you're going to see many people say, enough is enough.
All right. Well, we got time for just one final question. Bob, did any questions come in on your end for him?
I don't have anything on my end. I mean, I could give you a whole slew of questions, but Tim, why don't you take the lead?
Well, he has some news that he wants to share real quick before we end.
All right, we can close with that. We just got 1 minute left. You've got an update of what's going on with Pastor Mike.
Yeah, something Mark has been. When I first met Mark, it was via telephone during COVID in the beginning, because he was involved in litigation challenging the COVID lockdowns in California. I don't remember exactly the context of your situation, but one of our cases, we just had a major victory for Mike McClure, and Calvary Chapel San Jose in particular, where their contempt charges were just overturned an hour ago by the California Court of Appeal, and all of the fines and sanctions that were levied by the Superior Court judge for Mike McClure and the church violating the judge's orders have also been reversed and overturned.
Outstanding.
Huge victory. So, it's lawyers like Mark and, in our organization who have been out there fighting, and this is a major, major win. So, there's hope. There's a lot of hope that and I hope, Mark, you win, and we get someone like yourself in Senate. We get you in Senate to be able to turn back the tide.
All right. Well, hey, we're out of time. Just one final time asking you, Mark, how can people connect with you? How can they give to your campaign? How can they be involved?
MarkMeuser.com, MarkMeuser.com. You can sign up for my email newsletter. You can sign up to volunteer, and you can also make a contribution. And, of course, you can read the People's Plan.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in online here. We're going to continue to bring people like Mark on who we want to make sure that you get educated, that you know who to vote for. Clearly, Mark is the right choice right here in the state of California. So we'll see you next time right here on Our Watch with Tim Thompson.